Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Tuesday, October 2nd, and the Yankees will face the Oakland A's in the wildcard game tomorrow night in the Bronx at 8 p.m. on TBS. I'll be live tweeting that game, and this will be the fourth time that the Yankees meet the A's in the postseason, and we'll try to make it 4-0. Back in 1981, the Bombers swept Oakland in the ALCS. I remember that well. Greg Nettles had just an insane series with 9 RBIs in that 3-game sweep. The next matchup came in 2000. That was a series we talked about a couple weeks ago on our segment on the 2000 Yankees. The Yankees won Game 5 of that series on the road, as they did the following season when Jeter made his immortal flip play. If you watch the movie Moneyball, which I think is probably the best baseball movie ever, you can see that play at the very top of that film. But none of that matters now. History can't help us. It's all about the players on the field, and the result of this single game will play a massive role in establishing the final storyline for this 2018 season, which we here at Bronx Bombers have been privileged to share with you, our listeners. You can follow us on Twitter at Bombers Podcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here in the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well, or give us a call, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe at bronxbomberspodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked who you think is going to win the series between the Astros and the Indians, and I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about the bullpen matchup between the Yankees and the A's. Also, he's the editor-in-chief of the blog Start Spreading the News. Our friend Dr. Paul Semendinger rejoins the show to talk wild card and more, and we'll review the 2018 Major League Baseball season, looking back at some of my predictions back in March and seeing what I got right and what I got wrong. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of the following players is the only one not to play for both the Yankees and the Mets? Is it A. Lee Mazzilli, B. Gene Woodling, C. Phil Linz, or D. Rusty Staub? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
So this is it, guys. Do or die. We did it last year, and we're doing it again. And no, I don't have any predictions for the game Wednesday night. Predicting the outcome of one game between two evenly matched teams is, I think, a fool's errand. And no, home field really doesn't matter a whole lot historically, so it's really just sit back and see what happens. And I'll get into this game a lot more with Dr. Paul Semendinger after this segment, and I'll get into the Oakland bullpen in our mailbag segment later in this podcast. But back in March, on episodes 9 and 10 of this podcast, I did my season preview with my picks for the final regular season records for all 30 teams. I used the over-under numbers out of Vegas as a baseline, and you know, as one might predict, the results were kind of all over the place. I was wrong as much as I was right. I went 15-15. It was interesting. I did better with my picks in the National League than I did in the American. Maybe I was more objective there because I'm not as emotionally involved. And my worst division prediction-wise was actually our very own American League East, where my pick of the Yankees to go over, Vegas had them at 94.5. That was the only one I got right in our division. My best division, by the way, was the NL Central, where my pick of the Cardinals to get fewer than 85.5 wins was the only one I got wrong. St. Louis had a strong second half, but as I predicted, the Milwaukee Brewers had a big year after some big free agent acquisitions, including Lorenzo Cain and Christian Yelich. Both had just phenomenal years, and both contributed mightily in that tiebreaker game against the Cubs on Monday. I did well in the National League West as well, getting 3 out of those 5 teams right. But rather than go through each team's season, which we do not have time for, what I thought I would do is look at 6 teams that were surprises this year, 3 of which I picked correctly and 3 of which I did not. And we may as well start with a team I was wrong about. That's the Boston Red Sox, and I wasn't the only one. Vegas had Boston at just 91.5. I picked them to go under at 91, but of course, they ended up with 108 wins for their best season in franchise history. Now, one of my contentions back in March that the Yankees pitching was right there with Boston's, and I got a lot of pushback on Twitter from delusional Red Sox fans, but my point there was proven correct. As a matter of fact, batting average against the two pitching staffs of these two teams was identical at 237. The Yankees staff had fewer walks and more strikeouts than Boston. So for all the talk of Sale and Porcello and Price and how much better their staff was than ours, they really were not. And although Kimbrel had a better year than Chapman, the bullpen matchup, as I predicted, it also favored the Yankees. But what surprised me and the rest of the baseball universe as well was just how explosive that offense was. I mean, I knew Mookie Betts was good, but I didn't know he was this good. And J.D. Martinez, a late bloomer if there ever was one, this is a guy that was really a pretty ordinary hitter in the early years of his career in Houston. Some improvement on the Tigers for sure, but last year at the ripe old age of 30 was his true breakout season, although actually 2016 was good as well. But, back in March, I questioned whether or not he would duplicate those numbers switching back to the American League, and he most certainly did, leading the team in RBIs with 130, hits with 188, and home runs with 43. And, he signed through 2022, and that can be a risk with a player of his age, but it's been a hell of a year. I mean, and the top of their order has been the difference, I think, between the Red Sox and the Yankees. And as a team, their ability to consistently beat lesser teams is the reason why they'll be relaxing on Wednesday as we slug it out with Oakland. Now, a surprise that I got right was the Atlanta Braves. Vegas had them at just 74.5 wins. Fangraphs actually took the under on that, but I liked what I saw from their youth, from their prospect depth, and as I predicted, rookie Ronald Acuna Jr. had a monster year and will be the NL Rookie of the Year without question. He leads the team with 26 home runs. His OPS of 921 leads the team as well. Just a super gifted athlete. And also, as I predicted, a healthy Freddie Freeman was a huge contributor, one of the best, if not the very best, first baseman in all of baseball, hitting .309 this season, on base .388, and he led the team with 98 RBIs and 191 hits. Just a monster year. And on the pitching side, they got a nice year out of righty Mike Foltynewicz, 2.85 ERA, 202 strikeouts. And so the Atlanta Braves are the surprise winners of the National League East. And just as surprising was a team that I and pretty much everyone else got wrong. The team that Sports Illustrated in all their wisdom picked to beat the Yankees this year in the World Series, the Washington Nationals, who were just, I shouldn't say awful, mediocre might be more accurate, going 2 games over 500. But considering the expectations after years of piling up a ton of regular season wins, not good. And they basically blew up their team in mid-August, trading away Daniel Murphy to the Cubs and many others. Now, there were a lot of injuries in the first half. Adam Eaton, Brandon Kintzler, Murphy, Strasburg, but we had a lot of injuries too here in New York, so it's tough to know what exactly happened in Washington. Certainly Bryce Harper was not as good as he was last year or in 2015, which was his best year. And there's a lot of talk about the new manager, Dave Martinez, and team chemistry. Remember around July 4th, after they dropped below 500, Scherzer called a team meeting and basically tore everyone a new one. And then a few weeks later, cameras caught Scherzer and Strasburg in a furious argument in the dugout, and there was a lot more drama than that. And that's something you can't quantify with stats, clubhouse chemistry. And I've been critical of Aaron Boone for a lot of things, but that's an area where I would give him high marks. There's been literally no drama in our clubhouse all year, but the Nationals were really bad, and this could be the turning point in the power of the NL East, with a resurgent Braves team and the Phillies looking better as well. Now, another surprise, and this one I got right, was the Oakland A's. I'll get into them a lot more with Dr. Paul Semendinger and also in my mailbag segment, but Vegas only had them at 74.5 wins, actually had Oakland finishing in last place behind even Texas, which I thought was insane. And so my overpick for Oakland was correct, and you can't say enough about the job that manager Bob Melvin and general manager Billy Beane have done putting this team together on essentially a shoestring. But my final 2 surprises, both of which I got wrong, were Baltimore and San Francisco. The Giants will have their 2nd consecutive losing season, and I thought, with the additions of McCutchen, who's actually played a lot better in New York than he did in San Francisco, and former Yankee killer Evan Longoria, that offense would pick up, but Longoria had just his worst season ever, just did not hit at all. and it looks like GM Brian Sabean is going to blow up that team this offseason. He's got to do something. I mean, they're in the top 10 in team payroll, and they've had horrendous seasons 2 years in a row. At first, I thought it was just the Bumgarner injury that happened in the final game of spring training, and that when he came back, they would pull out of it, but they never really did. And of course, catcher Buster Posey had season-ending surgery, but we saw major regressions for the Giants from Brandon Belt, Joe Panik, and Brandon Crawford. Now, my last surprise, the Orioles, I mean, it wasn't a surprise that they were bad. Indeed, I picked them for last place. I had them, I think, at, going 77 and 85, but that was optimistic. They were just way, way worse than that. Historically bad. I mean, doing things that just haven't been done in decades in the area of ineptitude. They broke their franchise record for losses a couple of weeks ago with that 108th defeat, and they're only the second team to win fewer than 50 games since the advent of divisional play back in 1969. The other is the 2003 Tigers. Baltimore finished the season 61 games out of first place. That's 61, guys. No team since the famously awful 1962 Mets has finished the season more than 60 games out, and I feel bad for that fan base. The Orioles have been just terrible in every conceivable way. They've been bad in one-run games. They've been bad in blowouts, bad on the road, bad at home, bad in day games, worse at night. And as bad as they were before the All-Star break, going 28 and 69 for a .288 win percentage, they were even worse after. And their catcher, Caleb Joseph, said it all, quote, "I'll tell you this. I've never seen sports teams survive seasons like this without people losing their jobs, period. Players, you name it. It's a privilege to be here, but you do not lose a record number of games and not expect some retribution. Everybody, every single locker in here should be thinking, I should be fired because I sucked, period," unquote. Just brutal. Now, owner Peter Angelos did do the right thing for once and unloaded most of their talent, other than Adam Jones, and time will tell whether the players they got in return will pan out. They also got a bunch of international bonus money in those deals, and that team has not been players on the international market at all, really, and now they will be. So it's unlikely they'll be this bad next year, but who knows? They're locked into maybe the worst contract in Major League history, and I'm not even kidding. I mean, this deal makes the Jacoby Ellsbury deal look like, an absolute work of art. Orioles first baseman, 32-year-old Chris Davis, who was signed through the 2022 season, was the face of the 2018 Orioles, which is to say historically awful, finishing the season with a .168 batting average. That is the lowest batting average among qualifying players in Major League history. And there was a big article in Sports Illustrated about his year-long struggles. It's well worth reading. It's by Stephanie Apstein, and it's called Crushed Davis. Nobody is struggling with the modern game more than Chris Davis. And Apstein makes the convincing case, that Chris Davis is having the worst Major League season of all time, ever, period. And look, when you read some of the quotes in that article from Davis, you gotta feel bad for him. Stuff like, quote, "I have no clue what I'm doing at the plate. Failure just follows me around daily," unquote. And he tells Apstein he wakes up every morning and thinks about how bad he is. He goes to the ballpark, thinks about how bad he is. He takes batting practice, slogs through another hitless night, and drives home thinking about how bad he is. And more than once this season, he's actually considered quitting entirely. Chris Davis has become increasingly religious this year, turning to faith to get him through this ongoing nightmare, wondering if it's some sort of divine punishment for something he did. I'm not making this up. You gotta read this article. It's all there. And this is a guy that led the majors in home runs just 3 years ago with 47, okay? So it's, I did a long piece back in February on the struggles of pitcher Mark Wohlers back in 1998 when he just totally lost the strike zone. This, 20 years later, this 2018 season of Chris Davis is arguably just as bad. It's actually worse. Mark Wohlers only had to pitch a few times a week. Davis is out there every night just failing. And, I know he's a millionaire playing a game for a living, and I'm sure, if I was a Baltimore podcaster, I'd be killing him every week like I have with Gary Sanchez. But I got to say, I hope he can figure this out next year, or if not, that, he can find another line of work that can bring him some satisfaction, because this kind of failure daily in front of thousands of people just can't be any kind of fun. Back in a moment. We are joined this week on Bronx Bombers once again by Dr. Paul Semendinger, editor-in-chief of Start Spreading the News, a great blog. They do summaries and commentaries of each and every game and really cover the Bombers from all angles. Highly recommend it. Paul is also a regular on our friend E.J. Fagan's Bronx Beat podcast. Paul, it's great to have you back on the show, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Joe. The Yankees are gearing up for the playoffs. This is October. It's Yankee time. So how could I be any other way than great?
You know, Paul, it's been a strange year. I mean, if someone had told you or me back in March that this team would win 100 games and set the record for most home runs in a season, that Miguel Andujar would break Joe DiMaggio's rookie record for most doubles in a season, that we would get 20 or more home runs from all 9 spots in our order, never been done, we would have smiled, taken a deep breath and settled in for a magical run to our first division championship since 2012. It didn't quite happen that way. Boston had a historically great season, and this Yankee ball club, despite the 100 wins and all the home runs, has showed some weaknesses as well. Now, you followed this team for decades, as I have. Just from a fan's perspective, how would you characterize this regular season that just ended? And do you think it's possible that in this last week of the regular season, we may have seen this Yankee team get hot all at the same time for the very first time this year?
Wow, that's a number of questions, Joe. And once again, I didn't say thank you for having me on. So I do appreciate that you made the time for me. And I do love sitting in with you and talking Yankee baseball. So going back to the beginning of the question, when you said, would I believe that the Yankees would set the home run record? The answer to that is yes. My son, Ethan, who also writes for the blog and is a big Yankee fan, was actually tracking the Yankees. He made a program where he tracked the Yankees' home run against the Seattle Mariners game by game. And the Yankees, for a period, were well above that rate. And it looked like they'd sail to that home run title easily. Now, if you ask me, would the Yankees set the home run title with nobody hitting 40 home runs, with Gary Sanchez playing poorly, with Greg Bird playing poorly, and with Aaron Judge injured for most of the summer months, I would have said there's not a chance. So the fact that they did it is amazing. And the fact that they won 100 games is amazing, because as I look back and I think back about my commentary all year long, this was a frustrating team to watch and to root for. They ended up with a great record. Right, 100 wins normally wins the division. You would think a 100-win season would make everybody very, very, very happy, but it didn't come easy. And somehow, with a hot streak at the very end, they made it there. I've reflected and thought maybe I've been a little too critical on the team all year, because in some ways, it's been a magical run, but it's been a strange magical run.
Now, it's worth pointing out that the Yankees do have the third best record in all of baseball, behind only the Red Sox and the Astros, and yet, here we are for the third time in the last 4 years playing a do-or-die wildcard game, whereas Cleveland, with 10 fewer wins, gets to sit back and watch us sweat it out because of this new playoff formula. Well, it's not so new. It's since 2012. But, I mean, if Major League Baseball had set up their playoff format strictly by merit, the way the NHL does, the Indians would be playing the A's on Wednesday, not the Yankees. So while I understand why they've set it up the way they have, to make divisional games more compelling and to keep more teams in the mix, is this system fair the way it's set up? I mean, should merit be rewarded, or is the current system a good system in your opinion?
I'm never a big fan in baseball, which is a marathon, of the one-game playoff. We've seen enough games to know that any one game, any one thing can happen, which would change the game. And the statistics, though I don't have them on hand, would back up that even a borderline pitch called either a ball or a strike at a certain point in the game could really change an at-bat, which could really change an entire game. And so I'm not a big fan of the one-game playoff. I understand why baseball has done what they do in regard to the playoffs. You said it. It keeps a lot of teams in races. It keeps a lot of fans interested in the game. But there is something, and I'm too young to know, but magical about the days before divisional play when the top teams went to the World Series. And it would be kind of nice if they could still have the divisions, but if they actually seeded the playoffs according to how many wins you end up at the end of the regular season. That would actually be more fair. I think you're right. The Indians should be the team playing for the wild card, not the Yankees.
So I've been looking back at some of the one-and-done games in Major League history, either tiebreakers or wild card play-in games, and this will be the Yankees' fourth. Last year, of course, we beat the Twins. Back in 2015, we were beaten by Houston. Those were wild card play-in games, but back in 1978 was perhaps the most famous and exciting one-and-done game in history, our tiebreaker against Boston up in Fenway, the famous Bucky Dent game, which I watched with my family as a 9-year-old. I'll never forget it. Now, we're about the same age, so tell us what you remember about that game and anything else from that magical 1978 season, if you would.
Well, 78 was magical. I have a year on you, so I was 10 when that game was played. I became a Yankee fan in 1977, and by 1978, I just thought the Yankees were the team that always won the World Series and would always go to the World Series. Now, I just talked bad about a one-game playoff. In 78, or any time two teams are tied for first place, I get it. You can't have a whole playoff series to go to the playoffs. So I'm not opposed to a one-game playoff to decide who wins the division. And that was just a remarkable game. Now, my history with that game is a little different than most others because my father, a great man, is a longtime Red Sox fan. So his little 10-year-old boy was rooting for the Yankees, and he was long suffering with the Red Sox. The thing I remember most is Yaz popping up to end the game. He popped up to third base. My favorite player was Greg Nettles. He caught the ball, and I jumped around jubilantly, ran outside the house, saw my neighbor next door, and we were jumping up and down. And it's only in adulthood that I realized that must have been very hard for my dad, as he sees his team lose again, which is what the Red Sox did his whole life until the 21st century, while his little 10-year-old son, who's just embracing baseball for the last few years, gets to see his team advance once again. So that was a great game. I also remember Dent's home run, of course, and I remember Reggie's home run because that was really the thing that was the difference in the game, and I just remember always being in awe of Reggie. And I was sort of shocked at the time that Bucky Dent's home run, I mean, it came at a bigger spot, but was so much overshadowed Reggie's home run.
Paul, you look at these two teams that are about to square off, the Yankees and the A's, and despite the difference in team payroll, they're actually very similar. High-powered offenses, the Yankees come out on top in most categories, but not by much. The Yankees' rotation, for all its problems this year, is better. But of course, far more relevant is the bullpen, and I would say, they're fairly even. Maybe the Yankees have a bit more depth, and fittingly, we've split the season series against the A's, so on the surface at least, this is a bit of a tougher matchup than last year against Minnesota, but what's your gut feeling heading into this game, and what's your confidence level?
Those are two different things. My gut feeling is very positive. I think we're going to be in for a good playoff run. You said it at the outset when you said maybe this team is getting hot at just the right moment. Wouldn't that be something after a year where it seemed like they underperformed so often? That everybody gets hot at just the right moment and they ride off into October glory? That would be beautiful. So that's my gut, and I guess it's my prediction as well. Though, again, I'm never all that comfortable and excited about a one-game playoff that if you lose, you go home and I hate when that happens.
All the talk for the past 2 weeks has been who the respective starters are going to be, but this will come down to a battle of the bullpens in reality. Oakland won't even use a traditional starter, and they have some very good arms in their pen. By far the best of them is Blake Trinan, their closer. But looking at our bullpen, who are the guys that you trust the most to give us big innings, and who are the guys that make you nervous in a game like this?
That's a great question because all of the guys have had peaks and valleys this year. I still will always trust Chapman. He's obviously coming off an injury and he's not himself 100%, but I would have no problem using him in a big spot. Zach Britton has seemed to really turn it up a notch as he gets further and further away from the Achilles injury. Dylan Betances has been terrific, though he's going to be going on one of his longest periods of rest between his last appearance and this next one, and that sometimes means he's going to be wild. So all three of the big guys I'm happy with. Chad Green, I have no problem with. Jonathan Holder surprised me all year with his steady pitching, and I'm confident in him. And I've always loved David Robertson. The funny thing is, you probably are going to disagree with me. I might be the only guy saying this, but the one guy who hasn't looked as sharp these last few weeks of the season is D-Rob. And he would be the guy I'd be most worried about bringing in a tight spot.
Now, I know some people might think it's bad luck to look past the A's, and I'm definitely not doing that, but I'm not superstitious either. And the prospect of a series against Boston is so tantalizing that I'm going to go there for a second. So our mutual friend, E.J. Fagan, told me last week on this podcast that he's more concerned about Oakland than he is about Boston. He likes how our lineup matches up against all those Red Sox lefties, and we saw some of that this weekend in Boston. And over the course of the year, we've also had very good numbers against their bullpen. So let's say we're fortunate enough to survive this one and done on Wednesday. In a short series against Boston, what would be your level of optimism and why?
You know what? I'm very optimistic. And it's, as I say, it's kind of funny because I've been pessimistic for most of the season, even though they won 100 games. But now that we're looking at October, if this team is truly getting hot, and this is how we felt before the season, you have to put the Yankees lineup against anybody. Player for player, when you match the Yankees up to the Red Sox, the Yankees have the better team, the better players overall. The Red Sox had a magical run. Is that magical run over? We have seen in baseball history many teams who have had great regular seasons who have not been able to transition that to the postseason. If we look back to the 98 Yankees, one of the things that hung over their head, and one of the reasons that team was so remarkable, was a lot of people were saying that. They were great during the season, but will they prove to be a truly great team by sweeping through the playoffs? And they did. But a couple years later, when the Mariners won all those games, they didn't last very far into the postseason. I think it was the 54 Indians who actually beat the Yankees out for the pennant by winning a ton of games, and they didn't win the World Series. So I am very confident in a short series in the playoffs that the Yankees can outpitch and outhit any team. And yeah, I'm not really all that worried about the Red Sox.
Now, you and I, Paul, have both been critical, you on your blog and me on this podcast, of the Yankees' defense this year, especially Gary Sanchez. And a week or so ago, we both thought that Romine would be the better choice to start this game on Wednesday. However, Gary's bat suddenly came to life this week in a big way. 2 home runs down in Tampa, another in Boston, a pair of doubles as well. So has this uptick convinced you that he should start rather than Romine, or do the past balls we've seen from Sanchez still scare you?
The past balls still scare me. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I might be the only one in the country saying this as well. But you know what? Defense wins these games. And if the Yankees' bats are all there, if every single Yankee batter is going to be healthy and in the lineup, you can actually carry a guy who is a weaker hitter. Over the course of the year, Romine was actually the better hitter than Sanchez. Sanchez has the better arm, but as of at least a week or so ago, Romine had a better percentage, barely, of throwing out base runners. And I just think that pass ball, wild pitch scenario is something that is one of those things that a game can turn on. I'm not a big fan of momentum. You always see games and then they say, oh, now the momentum's on this team's favor. And then something happens for the other team and they go, well, now the momentum's on their favor. Well, if momentum was so important, how did it change so quickly? That being said, momentum is something that can take apart a team or build a team up. And if the Yankees are giving away free extra bases because their catcher isn't catching the ball, and we've seen this far too often this year, I think it could have a negative effect on the team's psyche and the game. And so I think I'd still put Austin Romine. I'd make the tougher choice and put him behind the plate.
Yeah, I mean, if we lose, I would just hope to lose because they were the better team. I do not want to lose on a pass ball or an error or a base running mistake or some managerial miscue. That would be terrible.
I agree. And we saw just a little over a week ago, there was the play at the plate. Gary Sanchez came out, he overthrew first base, and then he stood there. And Lance Lynn had to cover the plate as the relay came in, and Lance Lynn tagged out the sliding runner. And there's just been too many times this year when Gary Sanchez just hasn't seemed to have his head fully in the game. Now, again, maybe that's changed over the last week, and I hope it has. He is the catcher of the future. But boy, oh boy, like you say, you just don't want to lose a game because a player's, for whatever reason, not fully engaged.
So I saw a poll on Twitter this week about who the Yankees MVP was this year. My choice would be Miguel Andujar. I think despite the shaky defense, he's been our most consistent hitter, although I also like what Aaron Hicks has given us this year on both sides of the ball. He'd be my second choice. But who would you say is the Yankees' 2018 MVP?
All right, so we're going to agree. I think it's Miguel Andujar. I was just doing, and we talked about this off the air, the statistics. I thought he might have actually played in the most amount of games of any player. But as I looked it up, I was shocked. Giancarlo Stanton actually played in 158 of the Yankees games. That's remarkable. Stanton out homered Andujar 38-27. I don't put a whole lot of stock in RBIs, but he did have 100 RBIs. Stanton did compared to Andujar, who had 92. But if you look at the advanced stats and the rate stats, Andujar actually did better in a number of areas. He actually had a higher slugging percentage than Stanton. I think they both had a 855 OPS, but Andujar, I don't have the statistics right in front of me, actually has a slightly better or equal OPS plus. So I think throughout the year, Stanton had hot streaks and terribly cold streaks, and Andujar did not. Andujar seemed to hit from the moment the season started to the moment it ended. He just missed hitting 300 as he hit 297. And again, I think the defense has been a problem, but as I said to somebody else, they said, well, if you're going to sit Sanchez for his defense, then you got to sit Andujar. But I said we'd put up with Sanchez's defense if his offense was anything remarkably close to Andujar, and it hasn't been anything near that. Yep. So he's my MVP, Miguel Andujar.
You know, there's been a lot of talk about some of the negative surprises this year. Certainly Sanchez and Greg Bird head that list. I guess I'd put Sonny Gray on there as well, although that didn't surprise me as much. But who would be your most pleasant surprise? A guy that you weren't really counting on who delivered the goods this year?
Well, Andujar, I predicted he'd have a great year, but that's just guessing. You know, you're just saying, I hope he does. Aaron Hicks had a tremendous year, and he had never had a full year like this. He battled through injuries to do that. You know, Luke Voigt, I think on this very podcast, I said about a month ago, I'm not impressed with him at all, and I don't know how the Yankees got him. And then he became Superman over the last month. And a lot of the Yankees' success over this last month has been attributed to the fact that he's been so great. So he's been a pleasant surprise.
Okay, final question, Paul. One way or another, this season will be over soon. It could be on Wednesday, or it could be Wednesday, October 31st, with a Game 7 World Series victory. But either way, it'll soon be time to think about how to adjust this team's roster so that we either repeat as world champions next year, best case scenario, or win a title next year for the first time in a decade. So, Paul, if you could corner Brian Cashman somehow, like in an elevator or something, and give him an earful about what the Yankees need to do this offseason to improve this ball club, what would you tell him?
I would tell him we did a great job, or he did a great job, not we, in meeting ownership's demand to get under the luxury tax. I don't agree with it, but he did a great job in doing that. And now that that penalty is going to be eradicated and gone, it is now time to convince the ownership to open up the pocketbook and put the absolute best team possible on the field. The fans deserve it. The franchise deserves it. And it's time to go big or go home. And that begins, for me, with acquiring Bryce Harper. The Yankees need a big lefty bat. He is a big lefty bat. He's a superstar. He's young. And boy, wouldn't that add a tremendous element to this team.
And how about pitching?
Yeah, they have to. I think Corbin's going to be available. And yeah, I do everything I can to bolster the pitching staff. I loved what CeCe did the other day when he stood up for his team and he gave up $500,000 by, I'm not a big fan of headhunting him, but he didn't headhunt. He plunked a batter after the Yankees felt that the Tampa Bay guys were plunking them. And you know, he's got that grit. I'd always bring CeCe back, but CeCe always scares me because he's really just a 5-inning pitcher. And so when he goes out there, he is going to be someone who's going to tax the bullpen a lot. I would love to see the Yankees do something where they don't have to rely so much on CeCe. And yes, I would definitely go out and try to do whatever I can to acquire some top-flight pitching.
All right, great having you on, Paul. I love your blog. That's the Start Spreading the News blog, which all of our listeners should check out for really high-quality, in-depth analysis. Paul, thanks so much for being part of the show again. Hopefully we can do it again soon during an extended playoff run, okay?
Oh, I can't wait. Anytime, Joe. I thank you once again for having me on. This is always a pleasure. I love your podcasts. They are tremendous, and they've become a staple of my Yankee fandom.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks so much. We'll come back. More Bronx Bombers in just a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which of these players, Lee Mazzilli, Gene Woodling, Phil Linz, or Rusty Staub, did not play for both the Yankees and the Mets? The answer? D. Rusty Staub. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Who do you like in the Houston-Cleveland series? The Indians or the Astros? That series, by the way, gets underway on Friday in Houston on TBS. And 57% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said the Astros, and 43% said the Indians. So just some baseline facts. The Astros won 104 games this year, the Indians 91, in a much easier division, by the way. The AL Central is like a joke. The second place team in that division, the Twins, finished the season 7 games under 500. And as far as the head-to-head matchups, Houston won 4 games, 2 at home, 2 on the road, and Cleveland won 3, the first in Houston, the last 2 in Cleveland. Now, the Astros, despite their sterling record, have definitely had their share of problems this year. I would say problem number 2 is the shaky performance of Dallas Keuchel. Not terrible, but, 3.74 ERA. That's the exact same ERA as Tanaka. But problem number 1, I would say, is the huge drop-off we've seen in the performance of shortstop Carlos Correa, who was just magnificent last year, but who's been hampered for most of this season by oblique and back injuries. He was on the DL from late June until I think August 9th and just hasn't been the same since. Last year, Correa hit .315, this year .239. His power numbers have dropped like a rock, and he's also struck out a lot more. I mean, it wasn't quite the same disaster we saw here in New York from Gary Sanchez, who really had a lost season until now, at least. Correa was still somewhat productive, but certainly not remotely the same player as last year. And while I would favor the Astros in this series, I will say this loud and clear. Don't be shocked if Cleveland pulls this off, and here's why. The Indians can just about match Houston's starting pitching, and they're a better offensive ball club, in my opinion. Not much, but better. So first, the pitching. I mean, yes, Justin Verlander is the best pitcher on either team, and a guy that you've just got to respect, but so is reigning Cy Young winner Corey Kluber, who won 20 games this year. Now, the Yankees did get to him last year in the postseason, but the word was he had a back injury. Now, with Trevor Bauer, who had remarkable numbers this year, actually better than Verlander's, he had that injury in August with the fractured fibula. Bauer was hit above the ankle by a line drive in a game against the White Sox, but at the time of that injury, he led the American League in innings pitched, he led the American League with home ERA at 1.87, and he also led in quality starts, so we'll see with him. It's unclear whether Bauer's going to be ready to go at full strength, but the Indians are optimistic, and Houston staff has had issues well beyond Keuchel. I mean, Charlie Morton has had a sore shoulder, he spent some time on the DL as well, his velocity is way down. But what we'll likely see as far as matchups is Kluber against Verlander in Game 1 for sure. That's a hell of a matchup. And then Carlos Carrasco in Game 2 against Houston's Garrett Cole. I would say advantage Houston there, but not by much. And then in Game 3 in Cleveland, it'll most likely be Keuchel against Mike Clevenger. That's advantage Indians. Now, in the battle of the bullpens, you have to say Houston has a clear advantage. Andrew Miller has had injuries all year and got absolutely bombed on Saturday by the Royals, so that's a very worrisome sign for Cleveland fans. Cody Allen, their closer, has also had a very shaky year with a 4.70 ERA. Remember that game at the stadium where he blew that save against us? And Houston has better middle relief as well. I mean, their bullpen has the best ERA in the majors this year, and the Indians rank in the bottom 10. So if you're wondering why I favor Houston in this series, bullpen is reason numero uno. And so look to Houston to try to drive up the pitch count of Indian starters and get to that soft underbelly. Now, offensively, Cleveland has some real powerhouse players in that lineup. They scored more runs in Houston this season. Now, is part of that because they play more games against crappy AL Central teams? Absolutely. But just comparing rosters, as good as Houston third baseman Alex Bregman has been, and he's been great this season, really, Jose Ramirez has been just as good. Actually, Ramirez has been switched from third to second base, I believe. The Indians moved Kipnis into center, as they did last year in the playoffs, and a recent acquisition, Josh Donaldson, has been playing third. Now, at short, obviously, given what I've said about Correa, Francisco Lindor is a clear win for the Indians at the shortstop position on both sides of the ball. And at second base, Altuve's numbers, while good, have definitely dropped from last year. Last season, Altuve's MVP year, he hit .346. This season, .314, which is still good, but not as good. Last year, 24 home runs. This year, just 13. 20 fewer RBIs this year as well. So while he's certainly, I would say, better than an aging Josh Donaldson, Donaldson's numbers in Cleveland since they acquired him have been much better than they were in Toronto earlier this year. I mean, his OPS in Cleveland this year is .914. That's elite. And he's not hitting for power, but his on-base percentage is .404, also elite. I mean, it's a small sample size out there in Ohio, but with his enormous amount of playoff experience, don't count Josh Donaldson out as a factor in this series. And looking at the outfield, yes, George Springer, he's had a pretty good year, but again, not as good as last year, and Cleveland's Michael Brantley has been much better. And talking power, I mean, Jose Ramirez, Francisco Lindor, and Edward Encarnacion have all hit more home runs than any Astro. And the Indians are the 5th best slugging team in all of baseball. Yankees are the best, by the way, and Houston is 8th. Yankees, Boston, Cleveland, and Toronto, believe it or not, had better power numbers than Houston this year. So bottom line, we've been talking wild card and how anything can happen in a single game. Honestly, you could almost say the same about a 5-game series. It really is a tiny sample size. And the truth is, a bad baseball team is more than capable of beating an elite team 3 out of 5. And the Indians are far from a bad team. So yes, while I would favor Houston mostly because of the bullpen, I wouldn't be surprised if the Indians take this series. I really wouldn't. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Tom in Weehawken. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle, or give us a call at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Tom writes, the wildcard game will be about one thing: who has the better bullpen? Offensively, the lineups are basically a wash. Which team do you think is stronger in the relief department? Well, thanks for that question, Tom, and you are correct. This will, in all likelihood, turn into a battle of the bullpens. I'm just hoping that, if Happ is going strong, that Boone doesn't pull him for no reason, just to do it. I think that would be dumb. But in short, I would say that Oakland has the best single reliever in Blake Trinan, but the Yankees have more bullpen depth. So the 5 best relievers on the Yankees are, in order from best to worst, I would say Robertson, Chad Green, Betances, Chapman, and then, Holder and Britton have had similar numbers, so I lied, that's 6. But 6 quality arms to throw out there. Now, none of those 6 guys have had the kind of season that the A's closer, Blake Trinan, has had. He's been nothing short of magnificent, 37 saves. I think only Kimbrel of the Red Sox has more in the American League. Trinan also leads both teams, the Yankees and the A's, with an 0.79 ERA. That's insane. And an 0.83 whip. That's walks plus hits per innings pitched. So he's been great. Now, both Chapman and Betances have more strikeouts per 9, but they also walk more guys. So Trinan is very much somebody to be concerned about. And if the A's have a lead after 7 innings and you see him take the mound, that could be good night, Irene. I think Trinan actually might even garner a handful of Cy Young votes this year, although it's very rare to give the Cy Young to a reliever, but he really is that good. Great sinker. He can throw in the upper 90s, and he can also pitch multiple innings. Now, they do have some other guys in that pen, but each of them has significant flaws. Rookie Lou Trevino, who we'll likely see early in the game, had a phenomenal first half, actually better than Trinan's, but he's been mediocre since the All-Star break with a 5.86 ERA. But even so, he's capable. And when a team hasn't seen a lot of a pitcher, that's often, advantage pitcher. And only 7 Yankees have had at-bats against Trevino, and none has a hit. In fact, the only one to reach base is Judge with a walk. Now, another reliever we'll almost certainly see a couple innings out of at least is 33-year-old journeyman right-hander Yusmeiro Petit. He actually came up with the Mets, but he's pitched for the Marlins, Diamondbacks, Mariners, Giants, Nationals, Angels, and now the A's. But the good news there is one Yankee has seen a lot of Petit, and that is Andrew McCutchen, and Kutch pretty much owns him. I mean, hitting .429. McCutchen, by the way, also has very good numbers against Blake Trinan, hitting .375 against him with an on-base over 500. So if we have a hero on Wednesday, don't be shocked if it's Andrew McCutchen. McCutchen, by the way, also has good numbers, excellent numbers actually, against the pitcher it's being reported at least that Oakland will use as its quote-unquote opener, 29-year-old right-hander Liam Hendriks, and there's more potential good news there. The Yankees collectively have a .348 batting average against Hendriks. Let's see. McCutchen hitting 400, Gardner, who won't be starting, hitting 500, Didi and Stanton hitting 500 as well. McCutchen has had the most at-bats against Hendriks, who's pitched well down the stretch, but something else to keep in mind, Hendriks was just awful in his last postseason appearance. That was the 2015 ALCS, when he pitched for Toronto and compiled a 5.79 ERA. Now, another guy we'll likely see is ex-Met Juris Familia. He was a trade deadline acquisition for Oakland, but you know what? He doesn't really scare me. He hasn't been as good for the A's as he was in Queens, where he wasn't great. And he walks a lot of guys, especially recently. But those five guys, Trinan, Trevino, Petit, Hendriks, and Familia, are pretty much the best they have, and all of them come with flaws with the exception of Trinan. And look, so do our guys. But there's more pressure on each of their relievers because, first of all, they're not going to use a starter, and second of all, they don't have the same kind of depth that we have in the pen. And this is a very big stage, Yankee Stadium, and Trevino's a rookie. Familia, in his last postseason appearance for the Mets in 2016 against the Giants, got destroyed in one inning, 3 earned runs. Petit, who pitched for the Giants in the 2014 World Series against Kansas City, was not good, ERA just under 5 in that series. And even Trinan, in his one postseason experience, pitching for the Nationals in the 2016 NLDS against the Dodgers, Trinan pitched 2.2 innings in that series to a 6.75 ERA. LA won that series. So look, one game you can practically throw all these stats out the window. But I would say, Tom, that while the A's have one reliever in Trinan that has had a better season than any of ours, actually better than any reliever in the American League, he can't pitch the whole game. And the flaws I've pointed out in the others lead me to believe that the Yankees overall have a deeper bullpen. And unlike Oakland, we also have an actual starter who's very good as well. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, find us on Spotify, follow us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle, like us on Facebook as well, but most of all, have faith in the Yankees and enjoy the wild card game. We'll see you again next week.